Welcome, y'all. We want to be good with your time and get started. I know sometimes we'll start a little bit later. We got a lot to go through today, and so I'm sure as people roll in, if you're able or willing to share your introduction and also a little bit about yourself, what you're thinking about in terms of what you're worried about for instruction assessment around this New York Science Assessment, we'd love to hear it. And really not just because like we thrive on your pain and worry, but actually we want other people to know that that there are these common things that we're all dealing with and trying to support teachers and students and ourselves with. And so we're grateful for it. So thanks y'all for being here. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to the New York State Science Assessment and Scaffolding PLDs webinar. I'm really excited to kick us off by introducing myself and the two partners in crime that we have this morning. And so let's dive into that real quick. Hello, everybody. My name is Brendan Finch. I've taught middle and high school science for 7 years in Los Angeles. I left the classroom to build our sister site called rocketlit.com. And then I wrote a lot of the assessments on InterOrbit. Many of the folks here at different school districts in New York, we work with y'all and we're really excited too. I don't write the assessments anymore. We have a team of really awesome people that are much better than I at writing those assessments now. So I spend time talking with folks at the district and state level to make sure that we can do everything we can to support students and teachers and administrators with the NGSS and the NIST and three-dimensional standards in science in general. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Glenn to introduce himself. And Glenn, I think you're muted right now. I can see you talking, but.
Yep. So I retired after 37 years in Half Hollow Hills. I did a stint in Stanny's as president. I work at State Ed as a ed specialist. That's one of the people that works on the exams. My exam is living environment, and we are now transitioning to the new assessment. So there's been training and people are beginning to write. I've done the Science Olympiad for a number of years, and I'm a facilitator for the Ed Consortium, and I love this stuff. I'm a real assessment NIST nerd. All I do is really think about how we can make this better, because I believe it's so important that we get our students to be learning this way and be able to think this way. So that's me. How about David?
Hi, everyone. I'm David Jacob. I am the Regional Science Coordinator at Putnam Northern Westchester BOCES, which is in Westchester, just about 45 miles north of New York City. I've been there for the past 10 years, and my primary job has been creating Science 21 with a wonderful team of people. Two of them are here, Glenn and Brian, who's one of our participants. But we also had a large group of teachers. We worked with about 25 teachers per grade level as we were developing Science 21, and it was all aligned to the new New York State Science Learning Standards. Before that, I worked in Clarkstown Central School District for 8 years, both as a teacher and as an administrator, and I have been designing curriculum K-12 for the last 25 years. In lots of different states, in lots of different capacities. I've also presented at NSTA and Stanny's on NGSS when I'm talking NSTA, and NIST when I'm talking New York State. I speak both languages. There is a lot of commonality, and I like Glenn, who did a stint like it's prison at Stanny's, which made me laugh quietly. Luckily, I was muted because I laughed out loud to that one.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks y'all for for doing your time and being here. We're really excited to have y'all here. And thanks for folks who are just jumping in. We're going to dive into our presentation for today. And so real quick, I want to introduce and remind y'all, if you're not familiar with it, to what InterOrbit is. So this is like, the sort of like premise that we use, or my team and I use to to design resources and distribute them to our schools and districts. And so In Orbit's a website, and we kind of do a couple of things. So we have phenomena where students can take what they learned in class and apply them to something novel. So we really focus on the assessment portion of that, whereas David in particular, and then Glenn with David, have been done a lot of work on instruction and also assessment, but we are solely focused on assessment. So within those phenomena, you can pull questions, and we're going to go over some examples of our questions and of other questions today and build assessments with that. And then you get really, really detailed reports that come out of that so that folks can really dig into the data and see where students are struggling, where they're being successful, so that not only are you going through, awesome pedagogy on the instructional end, but on the other side, you have really, really good data to respond after students have taken some assessments, checks for understanding, etc. We do a lot of professional learning. So this is an example of some of that professional learning where we want to help everyone to better understand, how to address these standards and how to support students or teachers or administrators that you work with as well. One of my colleagues, Erin, designs all of our professional learning. She did her research on NGSS professional learning, or NISLIS if you're in New York State, and builds a lot of really excellent modules for this. So if you're interested in that, or you want to learn more about our professional learning, my colleague Julia just dropped a couple links into the chat, and you can chat with us about a pilot or about professional learning, or you can sign up and explore on your own. You don't ever have to talk to me, but I would love to talk to you if you want to talk to me. With that, let's dive into our session for today. So we're here to talk about the New York Science Assessment and scaffolding with the PLDs. If you don't know what that acronym means, you're in luck, because we clarified what the last part of the last word is, and we're going to tell you all about it. So that's really exciting. So our goal for today, our objective, is to provide context for sense-making and instructional best practices to lead up to success on PLDs and the upcoming New York Science Test. We're going to be here for about an hour. We may run short of that and have lots of time for Q&A if you have any questions for us. We may reach the hour. It's an adventure, and I hope you're here for it. Cool. Well, you are here, so thank you. Or if you're watching this recording, then you're there. Anyways, so we're going to go over at first pedagogy for instruction. Glenn is going to help us by setting the stage for sense making, and then David is going to take us through that to the elementary level pedagogy. So we're going to see some middle and elementary level pedagogy. I'll be candid that this portion of the webinar and all of the assessment portion at the end really focuses on elementary and middle school, because those are the resources that have been pushed out by New York State, and those are things that we can speak with in greater confidence. At some point in the future, we'll have more resources for high school teachers. If you're a high school teacher administrator and you're like, oh no, what am I doing here? Well, honestly, it's going to be pretty much same, but different for you. So pay attention to all of the stuff that we're talking about here. You're going to use this pedagogy and these philosophies in your work as well. Just want to be really clear about that. For the following 15 minutes, we'll talk about assessment and the PLDs. We'll go over some of the standards, because who doesn't like reading the standards? They're so fun. And then we'll talk about the performance level descriptions, which is how that word is. And then some question examples for this, because it's really, really hard to just look at standards and then look at these performance level descriptions, because that's not what students and teachers actually do. So we're going to look at some of that. And both Glenn and David have parts of their presentation that focus on what actually is happening in a classroom, which is awesome. Cool. We built a resource for this as well, so that you can leave here and share out with all of your people, your colleagues or other folks, an actual set of questions and phenomena that are aligned to different levels of PLDs. So stick around, we'll share that at the end. And if you're watching this in the recording, then there's a link in the description for you to pick that up. Cool. So we'll give some examples of PLD level 1, 2, and 3 questions, and then ideally we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A, but we're going to see how that goes. So without further introductions, I'm going to do one final introduction to Glenn for his introduction into sense making. Thank you all very much. Glenn, to you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having us, because I think this is really a great opportunity to share some things that we've been working on, and maybe add something to what you think. So basically, with the sense making, it's really something that's different from our traditional standards that we've been teaching for years. Prior standards didn't emphasize sense making. They emphasized knowing the body of science content. Now, with these framework-based standards, that's on this list, we want students to demonstrate that they can figure out uncertainties of phenomena. We want them to be able to demonstrate that they can figure things out. So now the dots. Oh yes, the dots. The dots represent the components of a sense-making model, including student prior learning, experiences, and the three-dimensional tools, the DCIs, SEPs, cross-cutting concepts. So these are just floating around right now in this image. But once we drop something in there, the last line, ultimately, we want students to demonstrate sense-making for novel, analogous, or alternative phenomena. That's the goal down the road. Well, let's go to the next slide. So when we drop a phenomena or a problem into this scenario, this would be represented in the curriculum or assessment that's not something they can really explain. So if it's a problem in your class and a lesson that you're demonstrating, you show the phenomena, the kids kind of maybe got some ideas, maybe there's some prior knowledge there, maybe they can figure something out initially. But even in assessments, the same story. They're going to get something that they may not have ever seen before. So they need to be able to figure out something that they are uncertain about. And there's where it begins. So sense making, this is where they begin connecting prior understanding. They use the practices and view the phenomena through the cross-cuttings to figure out the how and the why of their uncertainty. Curriculum and instruction provide students with hands-on, minds-on experiences in collaboration with their learning partners. Assessments provide stimuli appropriate to the practice and a way to view with the cross-cutting concepts. So they're going to start to put these together. And this is a collaborative group work. This is where the teacher provides opportunities for the students to begin making sense of what it is that they really don't quite understand. So that's what we're doing as it starts to come together. Okay. So important for students to experience similar or alternative phenomena. So over time, connections require less figuring out. So as they start moving through this process of sense making, they begin to get better at it. And the connections using those cross-cutting concepts, for example, they start seeing all of those things over and over and over again. It should become fairly evident that eventually these experiences will allow the students to solidify a way of approaching a method to figuring out new phenomena. That's what we need. We need our students, we need our future young adults to be able to figure out things because they've experienced something like it. And even if they hadn't, they should know a path to be able to get there. All right. Okay, so the 5E model, the 5E instructional model is a way to move students along to sense making. The engage with a phenomena, presenting some uncertainty for the students, provide opportunities for them to explore and multiple ways for them to explain their thinking. So the multiple modalities is very important, especially for the diversity of students we have today in our classes. Assessments will provide stimuli in the form of maps, data, text, graphs, etc., for them to use to make sense of various things that they're trying to figure out. And we need to provide them with that opportunity to figure things out. We don't want to tell them what we want them to know. We want them to figure that out. That becomes more meaningful in their learning. Students demonstrating 3D sense making involves using the practices beyond traditional skills, using the core ideas, not just factual knowledge that they may have learned from the teacher. And the thematic use of the cross-cutting concepts help make prior and future connections possible. Okay, so now we're going to do a little bit of sense making in action. The point of this is to kind of give you, the participant here, an opportunity to see how this path can go down. And this is a rather well-used example. So if you are familiar with this, this is an activity on the tuskless elephants. So what I'd like you to do is put your student hat on. View as a student and respond in the chat. Maybe, let's see. This activity is a data-driven activity with a video for students to obtain information. Students will analyze data, make evidence-based claims, and make sense of the cause of a change in frequency of an inheritable trait. Is having tusks or no tusks an advantage for elephant survival? So we want to take a look at that. So now I want you to analyze this data. Okay, you're going to analyze this data of elephants illegally killed in eastern Zambia, 2007 to 2013. What are the reasons they're killed? So take a look, take a moment, and maybe in the chat, what are some of the various reasons that people might be killing these elephants? They are hungry. Yeah, meat. Okay, but as we look down, these on the top portion, these are elephants with tusks. And we have some that don't have tusks, and they're still taken. But the big number here, if you take a look, poaching. Yep, and look at that one highlighted block right there. Meat intact, but the tusks are taken. So there's elephants that were killed for the tusks and not for the meat. Okay. So in this case, what you would want your students to do is you'd want them to really analyze this and come up with, we want to know why do we have elephants with tusks, elephants without tusks? What is happening here? So in this activity, there's a series of questions that the students will do as they work their way through. I'm just jumping right into it, but the students would be asked to actually do some math with this and take it and actually have evidence for the reason why they're thinking that the tusks may be behind the whole story of illegally killing these elephants. All right, next. So part of the story here, and to help with this activity, is we need to give the students information. They need to have some background about the elephants. So what they've done in this HHMI activity is they've created a video. And this video, you don't show it all at once, you show it in little pieces. And the first part basically lets them know that there was a civil war. This was in Mozambique. And during that civil war, actually many years ago, 90% of the elephants were killed. Now, do you think they were killed for the meat? I think they were killed so they could finance their civil war. So the students are finding things out step by step. You show a few minutes of the video each time, and the students are scaffolded through a series of questions. They also learn that elephants use their tusks to obtain food. They dig into the ground. I know I was in Africa and I actually had elephants around me knocking down trees. It's quite a sight. They also compete. The males use their trunks to compete for mates. So this is some information that they obtain relatively quickly by watching a video. Okay, next. Okay, students learn that the tusks is actually a genetic trait. So this is an important factor. It's not just a random thing. It's a genetic trait, and it's actually a sex-linked trait. But, they'll find out about it, and we want to make sure there's an activity involved so they can actually figure out that this is not just a random occurrence, but there is a genetic characteristic behind it. And that these traits are passed from parents to offspring. And you can see in this picture, most of these elephants don't have tusks, but there's one young guy there that has tusks. So we want to expand the data to see if we can get some more evidence for what we are thinking. So we're going to look at the percentage of tuskless elephants in different regions and do a comparison and see if we can figure out something else. And wondering, can males be tuskless as well? So let's take a look. The next set of data. Okay, so I want you to take a look at this data here and make some noticings about this. This is data that analyzes connects human activity, which is on the left side of this chart, and then we have other information here about the males and females with it, tuskless, and the percentages. Now, some of these were from killed and some not killed. Okay, controlled culling is where they actually remove elephants to keep the population in check. And the areas of high poaching, I guess you know what that means. But take a look also, even within the high poaching, there's some discrepancies that you can see. So what we're trying to do here is try to make some sense out of what is the deal. And I think you can see that, let's put that red box up there. Yeah, if you take a look at that, you can see that in whatever, I don't know if I can pronounce that, Luanga. In that area, you can see that there are some places where the percentage of tuskless elephants is really pretty high, a quarter of them. But also in another area where there's high poaching, 0. What's with that? Now, I know most of you are probably thinking poaching is the reason. Well, you can see that even areas of poaching, there's something else. So in other words, data, real science data can be messy. That's a big point, right? It doesn't always flow the way you think. And there may be now other information we want to find out to see why is it that in North Kafue we had 0 tuskless elephants. Why is that? So anyway, there's a few good points there. So another thing about this that I can see is you see there are no males with tusks. There are no tuskless males. What happened to that? Why no tuskless males? Maybe I don't know, but I would want the students to say, well, I don't know. You got tuskless females. It's a genetic trait. Maybe something else is going on that's making it so the males are not able to survive. Okay, so in the bottom portion here, we're now taking a look at where are we going? So support or refute a claim in general, the prevalence of female tuskless elephants is highest in areas with heavy poaching. Kind of makes sense. And this is where the students would be making sense that poaching kill elephants primarily for the tusks, so the elephants without tusks survive and humans become that selection factor. So now we would want the evidence. So in working through students, we want to do that. So in just this little activity here, did you see how this could help you make sense? Make sense by providing the opportunity for students to look at data, get some information from, obtain information from a video or a reading, and then from there, come up with this idea that, yep, it must be something to do with poaching. The poachers are killing for the tusks, so having tusks is a disadvantage. The ones without tusks have an advantage, and in that area, that's going to increase. Okay, so the point is that sense making with real science is what our students should experience in their learning. The pedagogical shift of using the 3 dimensions and students figuring out collaboratively with teacher and students as partners rather than being told is how they should learn as scientists. So now I'm going to pass off my turn to my friend David and my friend and my collaborator, David Jacob.
Thanks, Glenn. So Glenn and I have worked together for many years. He has been helping our people work on the Science 21 curriculum K through 5. But if we think about if Glenn was talking about sense making being the goal, how do you get there? I think that's the real challenge, is how do we design our classroom instruction for sense making? What we have had up till now is classroom instruction designed for information directionally from teacher to student. Student processes that information, maybe remembers it, and regurgitates it on a test. Sense making allows for students to get that information in much deeper. So let's take a look at some of the ways that we can what we should be considering when we're considering science education. The first thing that we look at is time. Sense making makes time. So when we think about the time it takes for us to lecture to students or to talk about something, that is pretty quick because we can just get information out. And even if we have really rich discussion during the classroom, really having kids do the sense making like Glenn had talked about, using those practices to make time. One of my favorite things that I heard from one of our elementary teachers is, because we also use the 5E model in elementary, is that a teacher looked at it as Tetris blocks. Because if you know anything about elementary teaching, or if you're an elementary teacher yourself, you understand that you have chunks of time during the day, and they can fit those blocks in different ways. Or even if you're thinking about designing learning through the 5E model, one of the things you look at are, what are the chunks that I can do? So the next thing we're looking at is, when you're designing instruction, you have to think about the 3 dimensions in every lesson. Unfortunately, I had not put that in the right way into the chat box, but at the very end, I was looking at this and going, this is the science and engineering practice that Glenn was talking about, analyzing and interpreting data so that students can argue from evidence. 2 different practices to be able to do this. So what is your purpose? So if we think about what Glenn was talking about, the purpose was being able to get students to understand a lot of science ideas about genetics, about environmental factors of what that may be, but there was a real purpose to the instruction and the practices that were chosen. One of the things that was also in there were videos and reading about the context. So when we think about ELA, so in elementary, the teachers are thinking about that all the time. At secondary, at middle and secondary, we are also thinking about, how do we get information to students if we're not in the process of lecturing. So one of the things I've been doing some work around is the science of reading, which is supposedly the newest thing in reading instruction. What I really like about this quote, and I'm going to give you a moment to read the quote instead of me reading it to you. Is really what we're looking to do in science instruction, is that the core ideas, when we used to think about all the content that we used to talk about, we're trying to focus on core ideas so that, like Glenn said, we can transfer that to new situations. So that analogous phenomenon situation allows us to be able to say, if I know about a core idea and I'm coming up against something that's new that I don't quite understand, can I apply that core idea to the new phenomenon and make sense out of the new phenomenon that I'm looking at? So that's the real goal here. So in ELA, the things that we're looking at attaching to these practices are constructing explanations, being able to provide evidence for our explanations, argue from evidence, which Glenn was talking about a little while ago, and obtain, evaluate, and communicate information. Whenever I talk about that practice, I slow down because there's 3 parts to it. One is getting the information, then being able to read through it, make sense of that information, evaluate whether it is good or not, what is the source that comes from, and then I'm able to process that in such a way that I can communicate it to other ones. It's probably one of the most powerful of the practices because it's where it all comes together. The other thing that's really great about these practices are the applications of math in context. So once again, with what Glenn was showing you, we have some math and computational thinking if they had to do some of that, but analyzing data, the tables, the charts, graphs, any kind of qualitative data. We sometimes leave qualitative data off the table when we're talking about science, where I will tell you a very quick story about kindergarten. We did the classic put the plant in the closet to have the plant grow in dark and light. And if you've ever done that, if there's a little crack of light, the plant grows really tall, but kind of has whitish or light yellow leaves. These kindergartners looked at this. We had them measuring how tall these plants were, and they were going, the plant is taller, but it's not better, was what a 5-year-old said. And I went, that is a 5-year-old determining that our quantitative research methods were not right for this research, but qualitative research. And they looked at that by analyzing quantitative and qualitative data at the same time. So at middle school and high school, we want to be able to work with that as well. The last one is our CCCs, which are patterns and cause and effect. So if we think about what I put into the chat box that didn't make it to you, is that when we were looking at the data, you're looking at the patterns in the data in order to identify cause and effect relationships. So what Glenn was talking about, whether we're talking elementary, the K2, 3-5, 6-8 or 9-12 band, we're really talking about a continuity of language all the way through. So if we go on a little bit further, I'm sorry, and the core idea. So that is my favorite. I almost forgot about that. But it is content and not core idea. It's not content, but it is our core ideas, because the core ideas allow us to apply that into different places. Trees and forest are our content, are our individual trees. The forest are the core ideas. Can we transfer that information over to another area? So as we look, I'm going to actually take you through a lesson, and Brian Vorwald, who was in the room, was instrumental in making this lesson go. And this happens to be one of our favorite lessons in elementary, because I can name that PE or performance expectation in one lesson. Very rarely can you do that, but Brian with his team of elementary 5th grade teachers were able to do this. So this is a 5th grade standard. So if you're a middle school or high school teacher, you may look at this and go, this is in 5th grade, but look at it very carefully. I want you to read the performance expectation and the assessment boundary. How far do you go? So the assessment boundary says, what do we need to assess, and how far is that assessment? So as we go to look at how do we unpack that performance expectation in order to write a lesson to match that performance expectation and go far, and sometimes in instruction we can go a little bit further. So my favorite phrase that I started developing this year was, if we want kids to play Rachmaninoff at the end of the year, we cannot play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star for 10 months and then expect Rachmaninoff. We have to incrementally build all the way through in order to get there. So in Science 21, in one of these lessons, we actually built a little bit further than they needed, but we were able to get there. So science and engineering practices, we're looking at students to engage in argument and from evidence, and we're going to use lots of different ways to get there. Specifically in this one with a model. So if you look at the core idea, the sun is a star that appears larger and brighter than other stars because it is closer. So that's what we're getting to with apparent brightness of stars. And stars range greatly in their distance from Earth. So we're not talking about how stars are formed. We're just talking about their distance. And the natural connection for the cross-cutting concept is scale, proportion, and quantity. What is the distance, and how do we get to that place? So as we go on and look at this lesson, we're going to do a little bit of, I'm taking you through a Science 21 lesson to try to say what are some of the elements that you should be thinking about as a teacher when you're designing. So the first thing that we do for teachers is to try to give them an overview and identify the phenomenon that's there. So just like Glenn was talking about, in this, the phenomenon was the prevalence or lack of prevalence of tuskless or tusked elephants. Here we're looking at images of apples, suns in New York City, the sun in New York City, and the stars at night in New York City. Those are the phenomena that we want the students to engage with. So if we go a little bit further, we also want to identify misconceptions, because we as teachers, we know students may not be able to get to where we want because they have something coming in like, oh, stars are little tiny points of light, or they look like that shape that's somewhere. What are some of the things that we want them to know? And we might want to, when we have that opportunity, to help the students identify those misconceptions. The next step is looking at lesson goals. And in Science 21, we start to write, what is it that we want? Thinking in those 3 dimensions and thinking about what they're going to do. So if you look at the learning targets that we have there, is support an argument. That was one of our learning targets here. To be able to also know the disciplinary core idea of apparent brightness and be able to look at being able to use evidence to support that argument. So what we do in all of our lessons for our elementary teachers is to really identify the standards. We as teachers, we sometimes get further away from standards. Yeah, I know it. In these standards, you have to make sure you're precise with your language as you go through that design process and have the students being able to talk that language. So we put those very up front and center in our lessons. It might be something for middle school and high school to think about. What is the what is the DCI, the disciplinary core idea, what is the science and engineering practice, and what's the cross-cutting concept for every single lesson that you're doing. So we go on a little bit further. We look at our lesson plan and we kind of talk about what is our groupings. If we think about our Danielson stuff that we're evaluated on, thinking about multiple groupings is also very important. So let's go on with a little bit into the lesson itself. So in this lesson, we started with phenomenon of being able to have kids look at two apples. So once again, apples are not stars, but they're apples, and they're something that the student can actually see in real time as well. We provide them with a picture, but they can use any of those two things. So here we have two apples that are basically the same size. Because of scale, they are changing their size or their apparent size because of their distance. So once again, we as the teachers were thinking through what is the language of the disciplinary core idea. Then we have them look at stars again, that our sun is a star, and then we see lots of stars. Why are they different? Why do they look different to us? Why do they appear brighter? Is because of distance as well. So once again, I told you in our 5E model, we use this as our phenomenon to get them started thinking about them and getting them to explain it. We don't do the explanation, they do it. We provide them with some certain prompts like, what do you notice about the scale of brightness or about the amount of brightness? What do you notice about the distance separating the objects and their relative appearance? So the questions that are pre-written are very carefully designed for the students to start thinking about what they're seeing. Go on to the next one. So then as they go in, we did an experiment or an investigation, not an experiment, but an investigation where we had students using a flashlight and a tape measure at different temperatures from the floor, and they actually look at the brightness difference between those. So instead of telling the kids about being able to say, oh, well, it has to do with how far it is, the kids are actually experiencing themselves. So we want them to start saying, what is the pattern of brightness that you see? And we actually do qualitative brighter, less brighter, medium bright, all those kinds of things that we work through. But look at the specificity of the language. What pattern of brightness of the light from the flashlight did you observe? And then the next question that we look at is what caused it? So there's our cause and effect from our cross-cutting concept. What caused the pattern of brightness? Just like in Glenn's, what caused the changing population? So even whether we're talking 5th grade in earth space science or we're looking at life science in high school, we're looking at very similar language that's there. The next question is, using evidence shown by your data, so the student-generated data, what's the difference between the brightness of stars in the night sky? So we're at that moment asking them to take their real-life experience and start to extrapolate to what the beginning of the phenomenon was. So here's the phenomenon. Oh, I can't really understand that. Do something and go, now can you? But we didn't stop there. We continued on with what this goes. So then we have them starting to look at very specific informational text. So using text in instruction is really important. So the first one that you see there is about the apparent brightness, and we're looking at some qualitative data. If you look at the graphic in the very bottom, we're trying to show them that a not very bright star that's closer can look brighter than a brighter star that's further away. And we gave them all qualitative. Then we also tried to say distance to stars. We're talking about a 5th grader, a 10-year-old who's trying to understand how big this is. So what that graphic and this talks about is about how the size, how the scale is different. And you can see all of this is about scale using that language. This last reading was also trying to reinforce the student's understanding of that apparent brightness, but now we gave them real data. That's above the standard. But we said, you know what? Some kids may be able to deal with this and take it with them. Some kids may be fascinated by this and want to go with this. Other kids will go, ugh, too many numbers. But we also have the qualitative thing for them to get to. So we're trying to give them some of that, and then we ask them to go a little bit further with what they want to do. So if we go back, go on, Brendan, and we can see what that DCI is. We wanted to say the sun is a star that appears brighter than other stars because it's closer. So those are the things that we want them to get to. How are some of the things that we don't get them there? So I pulled a few things from the internet of saying what's going to get us to NGSS, and these are all NGSS ready things, but they're limited. They're not necessarily giving the student the opportunity to make sense. their worksheets. Go on to the next one, which is my least favorite because it says NGSS aligned, which is such a scary thing. If we look up at the top left, crossword puzzles are vocabulary, but they are not sense making, and they are not moving them towards the center any closer. And some of these are really nice sheets, but they are not getting the kids to make sense that they can bring with them. And if we look at this last one, has something to do with stars. Great, let's do a constellation log. I don't have time in my classroom to do things that are not bringing me any closer to the disciplinary core idea or to the performance expectation. So we want to be able to make sure that we look at that. So those are some of the things when you are looking on the internet for NGSS ready curriculum, you have to do an evaluation, and you have to be able to say, is this getting them closer to the DCI, the disciplinary core idea, to the performance expectation, and are they using the practices and the cross-cutting concepts effectively and efficiently? So in the chat, if you would say, how might you use some of the elements of this design, lesson design in your own classroom? And that would be for where you're at. Special ed, I saw that Carmen was a ICT special education teacher. Supports that are important for that are something that you need to be able to look for as well. But that might be reading support. It's still the same supports that we have for any of our subject areas. But for special education students, that hands-on activity is one of those ways. Modeling is also another way to be able to work with that. So in the chat, if you could put any of the elements that you could see in your own classroom that you might want to do that. And I'll pass it back to Brendan, but you can continue to work on that.
Well, that was awesome, David. Thank you. And I'll give you all a minute to respond in the chat because I think it's really, really interesting. We see a lot of the air quotes NGSS aligned or just like a sticker slapped on a thing that says NGSS, or I mean, I'm sure in New York it's going to say NISTless, but it's the same thing that it was before it was NISTless. And so that repackaging is a tough thing to deal with because maybe it's something you've been using for a while and was appropriate at another time before, what is it, 2017?
2017, the standards were introduced. So that's what we are aligning our work to. Oh, I like
Anthony,
that.
Yeah,
Anthony.
So Anthony, you're asking questions about exactly what we're going to go to the next section of this presentation, which is a great question. So in what David and Glenn both talked about, obviously those performance expectations are like crystal clear. I mean, you see, David, like the word patterns, like evidence, it's like analyze the data, make a claim, citing evidence, everything is like crystal clear in there for the instructional pieces. And we'll go over what some assessment pieces could look like when we talk about the PLDs.
And if I could give a short answer to Anthony's question, is the PEs are three-dimensional, where all three dimensions are in there. Sometimes it's hard to pull out those three dimensions. So looking down to those supporting three dimensions of what's the practice. So when you're driving the questions in assessment, you want to be able to say, are they analyzing data? Are they creating a model? Are they using a model? Are they constructing an explanation? Are they obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information? All of those are what drive some of the questions. And then also the cross-cutting concept, like Brendan said, patterns, cause and effect, all those things.
Okay, awesome. I don't want to hang out too long here, but thank you. Thank you, Anthony, for the questions. And if y'all are watching this recording, then think about how you might leave those. And if you want to leave a comment on the video, then you can do that. But without further pondering, let's dive into the assessments and the PLDs. So this is the only thing that I focus on, is really just how can we assess these standards and how can we support teachers and students and districts with that work. So thank you very much, Glenn, for setting the stage for Sensemaking. Thank you, David, for walking us through what that looks like in the context of a Science 21 lesson, and then what it might not look like, especially through some of those resources that seemed very TPT-ish in their presentation. And so I really appreciate that. Now I want to take you sort of to the end of this cycle, or at least the beginning again, if we're looking at that 5E model that we talk about, where now we're looking at how we gather data and how we assess before we bring everything back around. So I want to talk a little bit first about translating standards into assessment and provide some context for this. So understanding the standards is important. We need to understand the performance expectations. Those are kind of like the performances that students need to do at the end of a grade level band. So most of those at elementary are at the end of a grade level, and then in middle and high school, they're actually the end of a grade level band is when students are supposed to be able to do these things. So New York State did some really cool work, and I think in this respect, New York is way ahead of all of the other states that we work with, because these performance level descriptions, the PLDs, provide really, really, really specific guidance for what it looks like for students to be at different levels of rigor and proficiency in regards to the standards. We do so with InterOrbit's question tagging. We have a bunch of questions that are tagged to different levels of rigor, but we think about it in a different way, and they're not wrapping all 3 dimensions together, that's a part of this. So we'll go into examples of that so you understand what I'm saying, where we're going to dive into some example assessment items that were from New York State, either released prior to this year or released this year, so that we can start taking a look at what those performance level descriptions look like in practice. And then I want to give you all an opportunity to name that PLD and cite some evidence about what PLD you think a question is aligned to. So we'll give you some PLDs, and you can tell me what you think that PLD is aligned to. And if you don't know what PLDs are, that's cool, because this is exactly what we're going to talk about. And at the end of the session, we'll drop in the chat the PDF that we created. So we built out different assessment resources for 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, and then middle school life, earth, physical science. And there are 2 pages. So there's a page that you can give to students immediately to give them an assessment driven by phenomena that has different levels of these performance level descriptions in it. And then a walkthrough for teachers or administrators to contextualize how these things fit together. So all of that to come. Yeah, please take them, print them, share them. We just want to be helpful. All right, so as things should, we're going to start with the standard. We're going to look at MS ESS 2.3, and I'm going to take you through a bunch of examples of this standard in the context of the performance level descriptions and then in assessments. So this is all about analyzing interpreted data, once again, on the distribution of fossils and rocks, continental shapes, and seafloor structures to provide evidence of the past plate motions. I'm not going to read the 3 dimensions because that's not important, but I will just say students need to analyze data. They need to understand the history of planet Earth and plate tectonics, and then they're also using the concept patterns as the cross-cutting concept. So all of those things should be present in the work that we're looking at. Okay, cool. So think about that standard, and now we're going to dive into sort of like how these PLDs were created with that standard. So this is a very, very severe simplification of the process, but New York State started with the idea that we wanted to figure out a claim. What do we want to claim about what students can do? The end performance is where we start. So that performance, just like the performance expectations, it's performance. Like, what do I want them to do? What is the claim I want to make about that? And then in order to, make that claim, what evidence do we need? And so what should we see students do? And that's what these performance level descriptions are built into. So what should we see them do at this level, at this level, at this level, and this level? Because that standard is really complex. So we need to simplify it into a more discrete, small chunk of what we can see. And then New York State went about the work of building these PLDs. I know that Glenn is doing some of that work for the living environment PLDs. And then looking at how we can build those things to sort of like scaffold up to proficiency and find evidence of that, and then designing questions to elicit evidence of that proficiency. And so those are like really broadly the strokes through which these were created. And this is what a PLD looks like. So if you haven't seen these before, here you go. So for the standard MS ESS 2.3, the same standard that we looked at earlier, this takes this and it breaks it into 4 levels of various, proficiency from level 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. Now, probably the most important part of all of this is that performance expectation, the MS-ESS23, analyze and interpret data on the distribution of fossils, rocks, continental shapes, and seafloor structures to provide evidence of past plate motions. That is level 3. So proficiency is level 3. So that rock Mononov that David was talking about, that's going to be a level 4. And that even incorporates things from high school. It incorporates things from other performance expectations into this. This is like if students go beyond not just the understanding of the performance expectation, but they can like apply other information and skills from other, like DCIs or SEPs, they get up to the level 4. But the level 3 is written to the level of the performance expectation. And we're looking at question examples that are at that level 3 or maybe are not at that level 3. And we'll take a look at what evidence we can cite from the questions and from these PLDs to look at that. You'll also see questions that hit maybe a level 1, definitely a level 2, and certainly a level 3 on the science assessment. But let's take a look at some questions to see what these things look like in practice. So just to review this real quick. So all of these, every single one of these uses the terms that we find for the SEPs, the DCIs, and the cross-cutting concepts. So everything talks about using data as evidence, using data, identify the evidence, or analyze and interpret data on the distribution of fossils. So all of these use the SEP very, very, very clearly within each of these levels 1, 2, and 3. In addition to using the SEP, we're also going to see the DCIs, so tectonic processes and fossils and rocks can be used to support these. So everything has that past plate motion, fossils and rocks, past plate motion, fossils and rocks. Every single one of these is looking at providing evidence, identifying evidence, or identifying explanation that relates to those things. So just to say, and in these cases, so the word patterns is not found explicitly, but implicitly every single one of these standards requires students to understand how patterns are coming together in fossils, in rocks, in continental shapes. All of those things are patterns. That is what this is. So you'll see some overlap in these the DCI or the SEP to that cross-cutting concept. So just to say that explicitly, though it doesn't say the word patterns there, all of those things are patterns. So that's important. All right, so let's dive into a 2022 release test item from the from last year. And I want you to answer this question. So what PLD is this question written to? And if possible, I want you to try to cite evidence to explain what level you think this is written to. So this is not the new assessment. This is an old assessment and an old release test item. And so this question asks, so this map below shows a portion of Earth's surface where 2 tectonic plates are located. So we tell them tectonic plates. We're like giving cues for this. The arrows indicate the direction of plate movement across the boundary between the 2 plates, and those arrows are pointed away from each other. So there's another nice little cue for you. And then we ask the question, so if the African plate and the Arabian plate continue to move in the directions the arrows indicate, the Red Sea will most likely become, and there are a bunch of multiple choice answers here. Okay, so in the chat, let me know, what level do you think this is at? So I'm going to go through and do a little analysis right now because I don't want to completely put this on you at the beginning. But later on, I'm not going to do any analysis. I want to see what y'all think. And so what I see, so there's obviously, we're talking about plate tectonics here. Like this is a plate tectonics question. I see there's this image down here of like these plates and there's arrows showing where those plates move. But everything else in all of these PLDs, we're identifying an explanation that supports something, or we're identifying the evidence that supports something. So this question does not ask students to identify the evidence. I don't see evidence anywhere here. I don't see an explanation anywhere here. They're not identifying an explanation or using data as evidence. All they're doing is they're using this picture, and this is a simple recall question. You either know what this is or you don't know what this is. Okay, so Teresa says level 1. Teresa, I'm curious, what evidence would you cite to say that this is a level 1 question? They're not analyzing data; it's all provided to them. I totally agree with that. So I'm gonna say that this is actually like a level 0. So this falls here before even these level. Yeah, thank you, Brian. Brian nailed it too. So they're not even identifying explanation, because these aren't really explanations. These are just facts. These are just things that you know, and they're not using data in any meaningful way. This is just like, you either know that that is like a divergent plate boundary, or you don't know that that is a divergent plate boundary. And I think that digital nature of these questions is a good sign that this is not, there's no sense making available to students here. Like, they don't have the opportunity to do that in any way. And instead, they're just telling you something they know. Now, I know this is a multiple choice question, and it is definitely harder to write more complex multiple choice questions than it is for response questions. Like, this is a fact. However, you will find multiple choice questions that are at a higher level than this. But this is as Brian said in the chat, this is a level 0. This is not, if you ask questions like this, you are not preparing. This isn't even twinkle, twinkle, little star. You're just pushing one piano key over and over and over. And you're like, see that key, kids? Press that key. And they're like, ding, 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 ding. And that's all they know how to do. So this is way, 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 like, if you're prepping for Rachmaninoff, they're not going to be able to do anything but push a single piano key. And this is like, can you push this piano key? And the kids don't know. Okay, I'm gonna drop the piano key thing. So great. So this is a level 0 question. This does not even register. This is a 2022 test item. And now we're going to dive into one of the new release test items. And we're going to do the same thing that we did earlier. And I want you to think about this question in the context of those PLDs. So this question asks, this is from what was released a year ago. The continent of North America is inferred to have moved from its location 360 million years ago to its present day location. And in this context, so these are the release test items that were released, like, I think it was a year ago. We give students some data tables, some maps, some images, and there's a whole bunch of text that they look through in order to answer this question. So I did not provide that context here, but probably, maybe, like Brian probably knows what these are. The rest of y'all, if you don't. So there is some data that students are given for this. So just to give you that context. Again, the continent of North America is inferred to have moved from its location 360 million years ago to its present day location. Provide one piece of evidence that supports this past plate motion. What level is this? Is this a level 1, a level 2, or a level 3? Brian says level 2. Do you have any evidence to support your claim, Brian?
We need the Jeopardy music for this.
I feel like there's a time where I would have like hummed it, yeah, and then somebody at the end of a webinar was like, "Please don't do that." So I stopped doing it. I got some feedback. Yeah, they're identifying the evidence. So level 1 says identify the explanation, and level 2 says identify the evidence. So this is definitely a level 2 question. It's a full response question, and yet still this is just a level 2 question. So totally agreed. You are correct, Brian. So because we're saying identify the evidence, and that's what we ask them to do, provide one piece of evidence, this is a level 2. Yep. So I think that the difference, Anthony, that's a great question, between the level 2 and level 3. And you could convince me that this is level 3. I am not set on that at all. But I think the difference is that we give you, or that they give, the continent of North America is inferred to have moved from its location 360 million years ago. So there's an inference that's given. We say, here's the conclusion, now support it. And I think if that was not there, then you could make a claim that that you have in fact hit level 3. All right, y'all. So I know we're at this is good. So I know we're at 30 after. If you have to roll, we're still recording this. We have one more question to go over. Well, 2 more questions, and then we're going to wrap up. So if you have maybe like 3 to 5 minutes, then we'll finish this up. But if you're at hard stop at 30 after, I want to call out, thank you for being here with us, and we'll continue on. Okay, cool. So just diving a little bit further into this. So the last question, or the second to last question that we're going to look at, is another new release test item. And this is a multiple choice item because I think that's interesting too. So this asks students, which piece of evidence could be used to support the claim that New York State was covered by water about 400 million years ago? Again, I give students a bunch of data, and they have to choose which piece of evidence could be used to support that claim. Yep, and the cluster does have maps. You're exactly right. All right, do you think this is level 1, 2, or 3? Or 4? I mean, could be 4. Okay, let's go through this a little bit together. So which piece of evidence, right? Identify the evidence, right? Okay, so I hear that. So this says identify the evidence. Which piece of evidence could be used to support the claim that New York State was covered by that? So I see evidence. Brian said level 3, they have to understand or interpret the data in order to select the answer. Okay, so they're given a claim, which I feel like some of these, so level 1 says using data as evidence, identify the explanation here. And level 2 says using data, identify the evidence that supports the fact that there have been past plate motions. So I think I'm going to agree with Christopher here that identify the evidence, which piece of evidence is what we're looking at. Brian, do you have any reason to think that it is a level 3 instead of a level 2? Or David and Glenn, what are your thoughts? Could this be a level 3?
I think one of the things that Brian put in his previous answer was that they have to understand or interpret the data. And I think in some ways being able to understand all of that data and make sense of it is right on the edge. If I were to put this maybe 2.5, it's inching towards that interpretation. So unfortunately with rubrics, we put them in those places, but sometimes we have to say, is that somewhere in between those?
Yeah, and on this one, the maps is what they need to be looking at, and they really should analyze them, but they also, I think, a little bit of a giveaway in this is it says marine fossils, and contain marine fossils. I think that was the answer to this. In the exposed rocks. So it sort of is they're just looking at the picture, and it could give it away just by looking at the picture without doing any deep analysis. So yeah, I kind of like the 2.5 range. They have to analyze, but it's not a tough analysis.
And I think that just goes to show that in all of these questions that there is room for interpretation in terms of like, it's not just clear that this is definitely like sense making. It's not sense making. This is a PLD level 2 or 3. That's super interesting. Awesome. So great, Brian. And David and Glenn, thank you for sharing your thoughts as well. Super interesting. So thank you for walking us through that. So I also want to walk you through another one of our questions. So this is an inner orbit question. It's not, you may not be familiar with this, but we give students a bunch of context about, the South African or the African and South American plates. And we ask students, so we give them all this data over the course of a phenomena, and we say, write a scientific explanation of how the rocks on South America and Africa can be so similar when they're on opposite sides of the ocean. And in this question, so I'm just going to show you that there are these maps and that there's this data that's in here, and then bring the PLD back again. So I want you to tell me what PLD level do you think this question is? So write a scientific explanation of how the rocks in South America and Africa can be so similar when they are on opposite sides of the ocean. Support your claims with evidence from figures 1 through 4. Focus on the patterns and changes over time, and make sure you include numerical data from figure 4. So that numerical data is figure 4 up here, with the age of floor rocks, millions of years. Therese, why do you think it is a level 4? And Christopher, why do you think it's a level 3? You don't have to write a big, long response, but just a piece of evidence would be helpful. They're not asked to describe anything, just use the data to make a claim. So Teresa says students construct an explanation, support it with evidence they noticed, and reasoning according to science concepts. That's true. I think the one thing about the level 4 that makes it a little bit different, that's exactly what Jennifer just said. So we're not describing the patterns of plate motions and explain why these past plate motions have occurred. So that gets into plate tectonics. That gets into things like maybe we're looking at, like actual like flows within the asthenosphere or the mantle that are pushing those plates apart. So the mechanisms that cause the plates to move. And that this does not ask them about that. It just asks them about allowing you to, and David's yelling about patterns in the chat, but it asks you to allow, it does ask students to cite data and cite evidence and analyze data and reasoning. I totally agree, but I agree with Jennifer there that I don't see why past plate motions are occurring in this.
And I'm always yelling about patterns because patterns shows up.
So student answers might meet a level 4 in this, but it wasn't designed for a level 4.
And pattern recognition is in all of our subject areas. It shows up in ELA, in math, over and over again. It is one of the things we do as humans, is look for patterns. And looking for patterns in all of our data is how we start to do the analysis. So patterns, and the way that question was written with focus on patterns and changes over time, very specific DCI language, really helps the students to be able to help them focus on looking for patterns. So we as teachers in instruction have to make pattern recognition. It's natural to our brains, but we have to get them to articulate those patterns.
Thank you, David. Yeah, and thank you. So Brian, it's tricky to look at these questions and figure out what students are actually having to do. So thank you all very, very much. So this is intended to be a level 3. Well, we wrote it just for the standard, but this just goes to show the amount of alignment between the performance expectations and these PLDs, that because this is written to the standard and the PLDs are written to the standard, it fits within that. Okay, great job, y'all. Thank you for diving into this. I'm grateful. Thank you. So I want to also just use this time to show you and share with you the tool that we built. Hopefully this is helpful for y'all, where you can use this tool in order to give your students or the colleagues and teachers you work with an actual examples of questions that are at these different PLD levels. I think it's hard to figure out where we are if we don't have a concrete direction or maybe some points of reference. And so there we have an elementary and a middle school tool. Thank you so much, Julia, for dropping those Google Drive links into the chat. So if you click on those, you can download those and share them. But essentially there are 2 parts. So first, there are 2 pages that have a phenomena. Oops, I still have my scribbles from the last slide here. There's a phenomena and questions. So this is something that you can give to students over here. And then the second part is the explanation. So we're looking at the PLD over here on the right-hand side, and then descriptions of how each question hits the level 1 or level 2 or level 3. So we pulled these directly from the InOrbit site. We do not have questions on InOrbit that are directly aligned to every PLD level for every PLD. That's not something we've done. If that's something you're interested in, then talk to me more about that, because if you can convince me that we should do that, then we will do that. But for now, these are just pulling these questions together to give you all a concrete reference point for our students. If students can answer this question, if I'm answering questions like this, is this Twinkle Twinkle Little Star? Are they pushing one key on the piano, or are they playing Rachmaninoff? And what are we asking them to do in our summative assessments to prepare for what they need to do later on? And so what do we need to do instructionally to get them up to this point is another big question that Glenn and David have worked on for Science 21, and Brian too. Okay, cool. So we shared these links in the chat. Please check them out, download them. We'll also send them after the webinar. So if you're watching this recording, then click on the link in the description and you can pull those up. And that's it, y'all. Thank you so much for being here. You did it. We're super proud of you, and we're grateful that you took the time to be here. Thanks for hanging out, even though we went well over. We had planned for an hour. We did 71 minutes of this. We talked about pedagogy, we talked about assessment, we talked about scaffolding, and then the Q&A can happen now if y'all have time to do that. And I keep leaving my scribbles up there. Sorry, y'all. Cool. If you have questions, type into the chat. Otherwise, I hope y'all have a beautiful day. Thank you very much for being here. If you want to try and orbit out, you can find a time on our calendar there and check that out. Otherwise, David and Glenn and I, if y'all have time, we'll hang out for a minute to answer questions. Thank you very, very much for joining us, y'all. David and Glenn, you're amazing. That was fantastic. Thank you both very, very much. And if you want to give us feedback on this session, we're always hungry for feedback. Click on that link that Julia just dropped in the chat and let us know if there's anything we do better or clarify for you later on asynchronously or in the next session.